Hello, and welcome to the latest speaker instance from the Media Ethics Initiative. The Media Ethics Initiative is part of Moody College's Center for Media Engagement here at the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Scott Stroud. I'm the Program Director for Media Ethics at CME. And CME and the Media Ethics Initiative aim to produce more reflective, engaged, and ethical news users and consumers. And we do this because we believe it's an important part of an engaged citizenry in our democracy. And the way we go after these goals is by hosting wonderful speakers, one of which you'll see today, and also by producing pedagogical materials that wonderful teachers can use in classes across the nation, from high schools to colleges and universities. I encourage viewers out there to follow us on Twitter at Ethics of Media, or the Center for Media Engagement Twitter handle at Engaging News to find out more about our research and our pedagogical products. Right now on the Center for Media Engagement website, mediaengagement.org, there's over 100 free case studies that instructors can take and use however they want, whether it's in an advertising class, a journalism class, or a class specifically devoted to media ethics. So with our general contextualization of what this speaker series is about done with, I'll move on to today's speaker. We have a real treat in store for us. I tried to get Dr. Robert Talisse last semester, in the spring at least, and the pandemic flummoxed those plans. But thanks to the wonders of the internet, we can now at least hear some of his wonderful thoughts on democracy and polarization via Zoom. A couple words about Dr. Talisse. Dr. Robert Talisse is the W. Alton Jones Professor of Philosophy at Vanderbilt University. He's an internationally recognized theorist of democracy, and he's lectured throughout the world about democracy, moral disagreement, political polarization, and the ethics of citizenship. He has many books. His most recent, his 10th book, is called Overdoing Democracy: Why We Must Put Politics in Its Place. Some of the other books, when you're done with that one and you want to move to other ones that he's authored, are Why We Argue and How We Should with Scott Aiken, Democracy and Moral Conflict, A Pragmatist Philosophy of Democracy, and Democracy After Liberalism. So with the immense wealth of knowledge he has on democracy, I thought that the Center for Media Engagement needs to have Dr. Talisse give a talk on democracy, because if you know what the Center for Media Engagement is doing right now, it's engaged in a very large grant-funded research project on what we call connective democracy. And one of the challenges of connective democracy is how to deal best with polarization. So with no further ado, I invite you to listen rapidly, like I will be doing, to Dr. Talisse's talk on Overdoing Democracy, the Problem of Political Polarization. And before Dr. Talisse starts, I want to remind the viewers of this Zoom format. There is a Q&A button on the bottom that you can press, and you can type comments, you can type questions as the talk goes. And for the question and answer period, I will then pick some of these and present them to Dr. Talisse for his responses. So feel free to jot down questions at any time during that modality. It will not disturb the proceedings. All right, Dr. Talisse, the stage is yours.
Well, thanks so much, Scott, for inviting me. And thank you, people out there, for tuning into the talk. Now, I've got a PowerPoint, so I'm going to take a moment to share my screen. There we go. You should now see my first slide. So the talk is about polarization. And most people lament polarization. It's not uncommon to hear political pundits and commentators on the evening news lament polarization, but it's not often made clear what exactly is being lamented or complained about or worried about. We need some nuance in understanding what polarization is, because not all kinds of polarization are problematic, and some degree of polarization might even be necessary in a well-functioning democracy. So I'm going to try to bring some nuance. This talk derives largely from the book that Scott mentioned a moment ago, Overdoing Democracy: Why We Must Put Politics in Its Place, but part of it also draws from a short follow-up that will be out in the fall, which is called Sustaining Democracy: What We Owe to the Other Side. And the image on the right side of the slide you're looking at is the image from the cover of that book. So let's look at the plan then. Oops, sorry. Let's look at the plan. we're going to move in about 4 or 5 steps. I want to first separate out 2 different kinds of polarization, 2 different kinds of phenomena, 2 different phenomena, we might say, that are both called polarization. One will be familiar, the other one might be less familiar. The less familiar, which I'll call belief polarization, is going to be the focus of the talk. And so we'll quickly move into talking about what it is and how it works. Then I want to talk about what belief polarization does to us. We'll see that it's a robust cognitive phenomena that encapsulates a lot of different kinds of cognitive and psychological biases. And I think that belief polarization is really where polarization becomes problematic for democracy. In the 4th step, we'll look at how this maybe unfamiliar phenomenon called belief polarization interacts with polarization of a more familiar kind in a relationship that I'm just going to call a dynamic. And I want to argue that the polarization dynamic is democratically degenerative. That is, it erodes certain kinds of capacities that we need to preserve and cultivate as citizens. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about what we can do. That part's going to be a little bit rushed, maybe too much so, but there's some conceptual reasons for that that we'll get to, I hope. Okay, so that's the plan. Let's move very quickly now into the substance. So 2 kinds of polarization. Now, when people talk about polarization, they're usually thinking about something along the lines of what's depicted in the graphic here. That is what I'll call political polarization, which is the more familiar kind of polarization, is this phenomenon of 2 political units. And if we're talking about the United States, we might as well just say 2 political parties. Sort of gathered around one another to such a degree that the common ground between them drops out. That is, we might say that political polarization is a metric of what might be called the ideological or doctrinal distance between opposed political groups, which we might say opposed political parties. Now, there are different ways of understanding what ideological or doctrinal distance is, and therefore different ways of measuring that distance. And this is why among political scientists, at least, there's some debate about how polarized the United States is. And in fact, there's some debate about whether the United States is especially polarized in this particular sense. We can talk, if you like, in the Q&A about different ways of understanding what's what's missing on the bridge there. But in any case, on most accounts of these things, there is somewhere within the United States body politic that is heavily belief polarized. The important thing to notice, though, about political polarization is that it's a metric of the distance between 2 opposed groups. So there could be no political polarization where there's unanimity or where there is not room for political dispute or disagreement. Contrast that then with this other phenomenon called polarization, what I'll call belief polarization. This is a cognitive or psychological phenomenon. It's the phenomenon by which interactions among like-minded people turns each of the interactors into more extreme versions of themselves. That is, the more we interact among people who are like us, the more we come to adopt exaggerated, extreme versions of the kind of views that make us like-minded with them. This is a phenomenon that is not a metric of the distance between some political group like a party and its opposing group. It's rather, insofar as it's a metric of distance at all, it has to do with a shift among members of like-minded groups from an antecedent set of commitments to a set of commitments that they shift towards in light of their interaction as like-minded individuals. So that is that unlike political polarization, you can have highly belief polarized groups, even in the absence of any opposing group, as it turns out, because it's really just a psychological, it's really just a social dynamic that that accrues to members of like-minded groups that interact with one another. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that belief polarization is a remarkably robust cognitive phenomenon. It's been widely studied since the 1950s around the world. It does not vary in any of the ways that you might expect it should. That is, it doesn't seem to vary significantly with level of education, gender, ethnicity, racial identification. It doesn't seem to vary significantly with economic circumstance, geographical circumstances. That is, it looks like it's deeply entrenched in our cognition. And it's been found to work without significant variation in groups of different kinds. That is, belief polarization besets groups that are political units like parties or interest groups, but it also besets groups and can be found and induced in groups that are organized around some low stakes commitment with respect to which they're like-minded. Just to give one very quick example, you get a bunch of people together, all of whom assess Brad Pitt as particularly handsome. You get them talking about how handsome Brad Pitt is, and it's pretty quick that you see the effect. They all start assessing Brad Pitt as even more handsome than they did before they started talking. And so you might say that's kind of low stakes. It's not sort of big ideals about society and justice and equality, just about the attractiveness of a face. Moreover, belief polarization has been found at work in like-minded groups when the like-mindedness is indexed to factual matters rather than evaluative matters. So even in the case of Brad Pitt's, the handsomeness of Brad Pitt's face, you might say that's an evaluation. You get a bunch of people together, all of whom think that the city of Denver, Colorado is notably high above sea level, for example. You get them talking about the elevation of the city of Denver. And the longer they talk, the higher above sea level they each come to believe Denver is. Now, that's not an evaluative judgment. That's just a banal factual judgment. And so you can find in groups of different kinds, organized around different kinds of commonality, among people without respect for, or that doesn't vary significantly across race and gender and ethnicity and religious belief and economic background or circumstance. You see this pretty strong cognitive pull towards adopting more extreme, more confident, more, you might even say in some cases, dogmatic expressions of our antecedent commitments. Now, one of the interesting things about belief polarization, in addition to all the stuff that's been said, is that it doesn't look like it's a matter of the more people with the more extreme beliefs pulling like a, drawing like a magnet, the more middle of the road members of the group towards themselves. That is, groups that are composed partly of members who are already extreme don't shift more quickly or more radically than groups that are composed entirely of moderates. So again, it looks like it's just purely social dynamical. Now, we might ask, well, how does it work? Now, a lot of accounts of belief polarization tend to focus on a sort of echo chamber kind of theory that, well, you get a like-minded group together, they just sort of reinforce what one another is saying, they share corroborating information, they downplay information that seems to go against the dominant organizing view of the group. And so it's really a social dynamic that emerges out of group discussion among like-minded individuals. And it turns out that that is indeed a reliable context to induce belief polarization. And it's a handy context to study it and test it and measure it. But as it turns out, like-minded conversation, deliberation, and discussion among people who are all in agreement might be, is not necessary for the effect. And in fact, all that you need in order to induce belief polarization is what I call mere corroboration. You can induce belief polarization by showing somebody a chart that says, hey, the people like you tend also to think this thing that you think. So if you show a vegetarian a chart that says, yeah, most vegetarians oppose genetically modified crops, that's enough to get them typically to shift into a more extreme opposition to genetically modified crops. So it looks as if what's going on with belief polarization is kind of a lot more like what's going on in the background of that slide than we might think. It's not about discussion or dialogue or exchanging information or hearing louder and louder echoes of our voices, although that's a reliable way to induce the effect. It's just not necessary. Really what's going on cognitively in belief polarization is what goes on with fans in a stadium. We try to fit in with others that we see as our allies. And the way that we do that is we feed into and feed off of one another's enthusiasm, and being affirmed, being corroborated, being elevated in that way leads us to more confident, extreme attitudes. And what that means is that, again, although the literature tends to focus on the experimental context where it's easiest to detect and measure belief polarization, which are experiments involving like-minded discussion, it turns out that if mere corroboration is sufficient for the extremity shifts, then our physical and social environments can induce belief polarization. And if you want to get a sense of this, just think about the way viral social media feeds work. The reason why people see fit, I mean, we still remember the most recent election, I take it. The reason why it probably wasn't so uncommon for you just a few months ago to see an entire lawn of somebody's home covered in the identical campaign sign, just, you know, the same sign over and over again. You might even think that this way of understanding the mechanism of belief polarization explains why audience size, crowd size matters for people who are trying to sway political, public opinion, maybe even political opinion and attitudes. Because one of the ways to get to get a view to be popular with people is to convince them that it already is popular among the people that they see themselves as as like or as alike with. Now, a lot of the literature on belief polarization tends to focus on what we might think of as the individual epistemology of the phenomenon, sort of how we shift into these more extreme versions of our antecedent views with greater degrees of confidence and greater, more intense kinds of dogmatism. And that is an important part of the phenomenon. So I'm not saying that it's a mistake to be focused on those issues. But one thing that often gets short shrift in the literature is what belief polarization does to us with respect to our conception of the people who are unlike ourselves. And here's the fact: as we shift by way of belief polarization into our more extreme attitudes and commitments and dispositions, we come to embrace increasingly negative attitudes of the people who are in the outgroup. That is, belief polarization as I just said, is sort of stimulated by the need to feel affirmed by our people, by the people that we see ourselves allied with. And that leads us to adopt more extreme views and express more extreme views. But it also leads us to seek to give signals of assurance to our allies that we're not posers, that we're not fair weather loyalists, that we're authentic members of the tribe. And often what that takes is amplifying and punctuating and exaggerating negative attitudes towards the outgroup. And so as we shift into our more extreme selves, we become more and more disgusted by, we become more and more distrustful of, we become more and more wary of anybody who is not a member of our own group. And what that means is that as we shift into our more extreme selves, we become more prone to dismiss criticisms of our views from people who are perceived to be outsiders. We become less prone to listen to those who speak when we perceive them to be outsiders. We become more prone to interrupt them when they do speak. We come to attribute to outsiders only extreme versions of opposing views. That is, we lose the capacity to hear differences and nuances among those who we, among the views and among the expressions of the views of those who we take to be our opponents. And note, the more unnuanced and extreme version of the opposing views are often the least plausible versions of the opposing views. Moreover, as we shift into our more extreme selves, we also come to attribute to the outgroup an implausible level of unanimity and homogeneity. We come to see them as monolithic. We not only lose the ability to recognize nuances in the things that they say, we come to see them as a group, as more or less homogeneous, undifferentiated, and similar or identical, we might say, in their extreme, unnuanced, opposing view. Now, what's interesting about that move towards this sort of seeing the outgroup as a monolith is that as we shift into our more extreme selves, we also come to see more and more of what the opposition does as explicable by reference to their extreme, monolithic, unnuanced views. We come to see more and more of their behavior as expressive of their opposing views and of their status as opponents. We come to see more and more of what they do as a threat, more and more of what they do as an insult. Eventually, we come to see everything that they do as somehow infected by, explicable in terms of, or the product of their misguided political commitments. And if you're wondering how that works, just think for a moment about how much of what passes for political criticism in the United States today is really just a matter of mocking the lifestyle of people that we perceive to be our political opponents. Just think about, attention Walmart shoppers jokes, which are pretty prevalent in the circles I run in Nashville. Or think about latte liberals and kale eating professors, these sorts of things. It's mocking the consumption habits, the lifestyle choices of the other side, because the thought is that those lifestyle choices and consumption habits and ways of being in the world are somehow explicable in terms of their misguided politics, and they are expressive of their misguided politics. So as we shift into our more extreme selves, we embrace these increasingly negative attitudes across a broad range of sort of target behaviors towards anyone we perceive to be different. Hence, we can talk about polarization now as a dynamic. That is, belief polarization by turning us into more extreme versions of ourselves, which then embody increasingly negative attitudes towards people on the other side. I want to say belief polarization begets and might even incentivizes among party leaders and politicians political polarization. That is, when you've got a citizenry that is heavily belief polarized and so highly disposed to see people who are unlike themselves politically as wholly alien, untrustworthy, unpatriotic, in some ways inscrutable, disgusting, worthy of contempt, that incentivizes parties and political leaders, and especially candidates, to valorize intransigence, to demonize the other side, to accentuate, in many cases exaggerate, the difference between the parties, and to present political decision-making junctures, including elections for national office, as these Manichaean sort of standoffs between, the future of the country and losing the country, or giving up on democracy and upholding it. And it looks to me like that's really where the problem of polarization lies. You might say that political polarization by itself, even if it is kind of extreme, might not by itself be such a problem, because after all, it's good for the citizens to have a clear sense of the distinction between the two parties. You might say that belief polarization is by itself not such a terrible thing, because after all, democracy needs there to be spaces for building coalitions, building political movements. You need groups to be energized around a common idea, around a common objective. So I'd say that neither of these polarization phenomena are in themselves as such terrible news for democracy. It's the interplay between the two, the way in which they feed each other, the way in which they reinforce each other, the way in which they create the conditions under which each gets perpetually amplified, that creates the problem. So if you want to say what the problem is, then we might have to talk a little bit about democracy, because my claim is going to be that as we shift into our more extreme selves, adopt more increasingly and intensely negative attitudes towards anyone we perceive to be different, and thus create the incentives for those who are seeking office and who are office holders and who are leading parties to accentuate their political polarization. As that dynamic takes place, our democratic capacities, I'm going to say, dissolve or are eroded. So what does that mean? Well, look, we have to think a little bit about what democracy is. Now, democracy is lots of different things. Democracy is, a collective decision-making procedure. Democracy is rule of the people. We could talk about what democracy is in slogans for a pretty long time, but it's really hard to make sense of the mechanisms and processes and practices of democracy, including elections and campaigns and lobbying and fundraising, until we think of democracy as a certain kind of moral ideal. It's the ideal of self-government among equals. And it recognizes that one of the byproducts of political equality, and again, we're talking about the ideal here, one of the byproducts of equal citizenship is that people get to make up their own minds about politics. So what that means is that part of the democratic ideal is self-government among equals amidst ongoing political disagreement. That's just the affirmation of our equality, is that we don't have to defer or kowtow to opinion leaders. We get to make up our own minds, for better or worse. That's just a manifestation of our equality. Now, we're often prone to think of that ideal of self-government among equals amidst political disagreement as a kind of, we might say, vertical commitment. It establishes norms and requirements for the ways in which government treats its citizens. And here you can think of sort of 14th Amendment stuff about equal protection of the law, the separation of church and state, where the government has to treat us as equals. And the way that it does that is by, insofar as possible, manifesting a kind of impartiality about the deep value conflicts over which citizens disagree. Now, there are all kinds of philosophical questions that one could ask about that vertical sense of equality and whether it's coherent or whatnot. I happen to think it's defensible and therefore coherent. But there's also a horizontal aspect of our political equality. That is, in a democracy, we are one another's equals, just as the government has to treat us as equals and can't just treat us as mere subjects, mere objects of its legislation. Similarly, as democratic citizens, we are equals to one another. Nobody owes us deference. Nobody is another citizen's subordinate. Nobody gets to simply push another citizen around in a democracy. And so it turns out that because we're equals, we're going to disagree about politics, but those disagreements are always disagreements among political equals. And what that means is that in the midst of our political disagreements, which are going to be heated, which are going to be volatile, which will involve certain degrees of animosity and adversariality, nonetheless, our political disagreements must also manifest among the disputants a due regard for the other's equality, which is to say that democracy involves what we might think of as an ethic of citizenship. We owe each other a certain kind of treatment in a democracy. And what that means really is we need to refrain from treating each other merely as obstacles, merely as subordinates, merely as people in the way of justice. We need to recognize, even when we hate the other people's political ideas, we need to recognize that nonetheless, they are our equals. Now, so if the polarization dynamic leads us to a condition where we are driven towards more intensely negative attitudes and dispositions towards people who are not just like us, if the polarization dynamic feeds into cognitive and social forces that lead us to see anyone who's not just like us as inscrutable, irrational, unreasonable, untrustworthy, divested from democracy, uninterested in liberty, so on and so forth, then it looks as if the polarization dynamic attacks the ethic of citizenship. It creates conditions under which we are increasingly less able to manifest the kinds of attitudes and dispositions that we owe to our fellow citizens. Now, you might be familiar with this kind of argument, the one I just articulated in broad strokes, if you're familiar with concerns about our social media environments, sort of echo chambers and filter bubble kinds of arguments that say, well, people are hiving together in like-minded enclaves. They, listen to only each other. They get their views about the other people from their own people. And so that's why, public discourse, especially as it occurs in social media, is so toxic. It's true. But note, if the belief polarization phenomenon can be induced, but simply by features of our physical environments, then those arguments you're familiar with from social media concerns or concerns about political discourse on social media hold a fortiori with respect to our everyday physical environments. And it turns out that in the United States today, our everyday local habitats have become, over the past 30 years, increasingly politically homogeneous. Let me put it this way. Over the past 30, 40 years, as the country in the aggregate has become more diverse, the local physical spaces you and I inhabit in our day-to-day lives have become, firstly, more homogeneous. So our day-to-day lives are more likely to put us in touch with people who socially are more and more like us, more and more like ourselves. But that homogeneity has, over the past, again, 20, 30 years, become more intensely centered around partisan identity, our political understanding of ourselves. Right now in the United States, for example, just to give you a flavor of what kinds of reasoning goes into that second premise, negative and disapproving attitudes towards cross-partisan marriage are now in the United States more intense than negative and disapproving attitudes towards interracial or interfaith marriages. And I could give statistics of all kinds of other sorts that suggest that partisan identity has become, over the past 3 or 4 decades, more and more central to our overall understanding of who we are. We might say that our partisan identity has become our center of gravity in our understanding of ourselves as social creatures. So what that means is that as the country has grown more diverse, our local spaces have become more and more arranged in ways that make us feel comfortable. But because our partisan identity is the center of our understandings of who we are, that means that our local environments, our everyday habitats, have become increasingly organized around affirming our political identity. So in the United States today, your consumer choices, your weekend activities, the more time you spend in a park, the more liberal you're likely to be in the United States. For example, the more time you spend fishing a year on the weekends, the more conservative you're likely to be. Of course, we know that news sources are segregated and sorted in this way, and quite deliberately so, for all kinds of reasons that we can get into in the Q&A. Their time in the local park, as I mentioned, the more time in the local park, the more liberal you're likely to be. The surest predictor of online dating success is co-partisanship in the United States today. So much so that it's now an unspoken and perhaps even not fully cognized practical piece of advice that online daters give one another, is that they need to remove from their profile any hint of their partisan identity if they want to maximize expressions of interest. We report finding faces more attractive when we're given even very barely liminal cues that suggest that the person in the picture is a co-partisan. So if you want to appear attractive to conservatives, put on your online dating profile an American flag somewhere in the background, or wear a barely visible American flag lapel somewhere, a pin somewhere on your person. If you want to appear attractive to liberals, pose in front of a big map of a foreign country. The more maps you have in your home, the more likely your politics are liberal, by the way. The more clocks you have in your home, the more likely you are to be conservative in the United States. That is, the interior design of our homes and our workspaces are even sort of cued to our partisan identities. Tote bags. The number of tote bags you own positively correlates with how liberal your politics are, maybe for reasons that are not so hard to discern. And in fact, in lots of these cases, you can start telling or unpacking the story as to why the behavior or the disposition is, manifests a certain kind of partisan identity. The interesting thing about tote bags, though, is that they often have political messaging right on them. The Whole Foods tote bags, by the way, the clientele of Whole Foods is overwhelmingly liberal. The Whole Foods tote bags even has a tautology written on them. Values matter, which is pretty much as close to a vacuous statement as one could get. That's just what that's what a value is its mattering is indicative of its status as a value. The MSNBC tote bags say, talk politics to me on one side, but then the other side says, this is who we are. So the message there is talk politics, but let me first let you know what I'm likely to say if you have that conversation with me. Interestingly, last I checked, which was a few weeks ago, so maybe this has changed, I suspect it's not, although on InfoWars and Breitbart, in their online shops, you can buy all kinds of objects and items and apparel that bears their logos. right down to socks and underwear and flasks and ammo holders that say InfoWars or Breitbart on them. There is one item that you cannot buy from InfoWars or Breitbart. They will not sell you a tote bag that says InfoWars or Breitbart on it. Tote bags skew heavily liberal. So what that means then is that our environments have become sources of affirmation and corroboration of our partisan identity. And what's tragic or problematic and troubling about that is that it's as if democracy has slipped on a banana peel, right? It's because we're taking democracy seriously, because we're working in earnest to try to enact citizenship as responsible democratic actors, because we're so invested in playing the role that we should be playing as a member of an active participatory citizenry, that we've allowed politics to saturate and our partisan identities to saturate every aspect of our environment in a way, here's the banana peel part, that ultimately makes us less able to manifest the ethic of the democratic citizen, because our environments, in being sorted in the ways that they are to affirm our partisan identities, trigger belief polarization. And belief polarization, as we've seen, intensifies the attitudes and dispositions that have as their content that only the people who are politically kind of like me are the true democratic citizens. And just to put it, yeah, democracy without real political disagreement, democracy where some citizens are not at all like you, that's just not a democracy at all. Okay, so what can we do? Now, I think the solution here, and two of my philosophical heroes are Jane Addams and John Dewey, but here I just think that the Addams and Dewey adage, the cure for the ills of democracy is always better democracy, I just think they missed the boat there. I think that this is a problem that can't be solved with more or better democracy, because this is a problem that emerges out of people doing pretty much what they should as democratic citizens. What needs to happen instead is what I'll call desaturation. We need to reclaim space and time and venues and avenues within our social lives. We need to reclaim parts of our social environments for what I'll call non-political cooperative endeavors. These are endeavors where we're not reaching across the aisle. Note that reaching across the aisle leaves politics in the center of the endeavor. So that's a political endeavor. We're not looking for bipartisan softball teams or softball leagues. That still puts politics at the center. And I'm not recommending activities where we decide to suppress our political differences and not discuss them and pretend that they're not there, because that suppression, that pretending still leaves politics as the organizing center of the activity. What I'm suggesting is that we need to recognize, firstly, our own vulnerability to the belief polarization phenomenon, the way in which our political activity, it heightens our exposure to the polarization dynamic, and why that dynamic is eroding and corrosive of our democratic capacities. So we're good at recognizing that in our adversaries. We're not very good at recognizing it in ourselves or in our allies. So we've got to take steps to try to recognize our own vulnerability to these forces, and then try to think of things we can do together, not where we're suppressing our political differences, but activities where our political differences are simply beside the point. We need to think of activities we can engage in where I just don't know what your politics might be. Not because you're hiding it from me, but because we're engaged in something where politics is just not part of the activity. It's as alien to the activity as the color of the carpet in the interior of your bank branch. Now, I can't see you, but I can strongly suspect I've got good inductive evidence that many of you are now sort of looking nonplussed and puzzled, and the very idea of a non-political yet cooperative endeavor strikes us as strange. And I want to suggest to you that that's not the beginning of a counterexample or a challenge to the argument. That the very idea of a cooperative endeavor that is nonetheless non-political, non-expressive of our partisan identities, that very idea strains the imagination is a symptom of the problem I've diagnosed. And if you want to get your feel for why I think it's a symptom, or if you want to start getting your mind around why I think it's a symptom, ask yourself, what is democracy for? What's its point? Now, here's what I want to suggest to you is at least the beginning of the right answer to what's the point. What makes democracy so important and indeed so precious, what makes it, such a dignifying ideal, the idea of self-government among political equals, is that it promises that when it's done adequately well, it doesn't have to be perfect, but when it's done adequately, it promises a stable, relatively just, decent social order in which individuals can devote their lives to things other than politics. Citizenship is a job that all of us have, not denying that, not saying that democracy flourishes when most of us are off not caring about democracy. That's not the thesis. The thesis rather is that in order for democracy to flourish, in order for it to deliver the social goods that it's meant to deliver, and in order for it to create the conditions under which we can enact our roles as self-governing equals adequately, democracy has to allow spaces and venues for human relationships that are aimed at nurturing and cultivating something other than democracy. We need to reserve space in our lives for pursuing valuable things together, like love and care, support, creativity, ingenuity, that might or might not have politics as their content. And when we lose sight of the fact that democracy is meant, and part of democracy's value lies in its ability to create the social conditions where we can each pursue other things in our lives. Not only do we overdo democracy in the sense that we contribute to the creation of a social world in which we are least able to manifest the ethic of the democratic citizen, we lose sight of the enterprise as such when everything becomes politics. Not only do we do politics less well, but we distort our conception of what politics is, because politics all of a sudden becomes about nothing other than more politics. And I think that that's pathological. So as paradoxical as it might sound, here's where I'll end. If we want to contribute to the flourishing of our democracy, we sometimes, not all the time, we sometimes need to do other things together. Thank you.